And thank you, Shrija, for starting us off on that note. My name is Ofelia Bello. I am the Executive Director of Youth United for Community Action. And before I start, I just want to give a warm welcome and shout out to my beautiful community of East Palo Alto. I see some of the members today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the CLG, to our wonderful consultants, everyone who has been a part of elevating the voices of communities like East Palo Alto, and communities like Pescadero, like Daly City, South San Francisco, working class communities, low-income communities of color throughout the county, throughout our very diverse county across geography. So thank you so much. Just to give a quick introduction for myself, I took the helm of Yucca earlier this year. Have been working with them for a year before that, and I have a background in urban planning and have a lot of expertise around housing policy, economic development, and community development, community-based community development. So with that, Jasny already gave a short introduction to who Yucca is by reading our mission. And excuse me, I'm fighting a little cold, so I'll back away from the mic if I need to cough. So in the last presentation, we heard a little bit about social, economic, and environmental factors that contribute to people's overall health outcomes, right? I want to echo what Shrija said earlier by really emphasizing that equity is truly different than equality. If we apply that to climate change solutions, it means communities like East Palo Alto, like Pescadero, like those in North County, are meant to receive more resources because they have either been neglected or underdeveloped or actively disadvantaged in some cases, and need to receive some of those, need a bigger allocation of resources, of decision-making power, and being enabled to have some decision-making power, right? In this presentation, I'll be focusing a bit more attention on those social, economic, and environmental factors that are the day-to-day things our communities are most preoccupied with, in my experience doing this work. To understand Yucca's approach to resilience work, it's imperative that I briefly talk about a little bit about our history. So what you see here on this slide is a little bit of that history. In 2007, after a 10-year struggle, Yucca was successful in shutting down a toxic chemical waste plant that operated for decades just hundreds of feet away from residential neighborhoods. As you might imagine, severe health impacts and disparities that exist to this day were a huge factor as to why Yucca became involved in this issue. Asthma, cancer, and a host of other ailments that our community members were experiencing propelled us into action. It's a quick side note that if you are born and raised in East Palo Alto, you will live roughly, on average, 17 years less than our neighbors in Atherton. That is a factoid that I got from one of the reports from San Mateo County's Department of Health. So just let that sink in a little bit. I'm not gonna ask if anyone here is here from Atherton, but if you have, just acknowledging that you have 17 years more than I do, on average in general. So things like that, things like toxic land uses in communities like East Palo Alto, or just bad land uses in East Palo Alto that might not be toxic like in the sense that Romic was, but exposes to really heavy commuter traffic, or don't quite bring in the resources and kind of projects that we need in town, are a big reason, are a big environmental reason that we are experiencing different health and more disparate health outcomes than the rest of our county. And in my presentation, I'll be focusing on East Palo Alto, but as I go along, you'll start to see, and I'll touch a little bit more on how these things look differently in other communities. So, in more recent years, we have been heavily engaged in issues around water, from water quality to the city's water infrastructure and sea level rise. In our most recent project around sea level rise, education and preparedness were two key components of that. And we found that our community is most concerned with the immediate threats to their stability and their family stability, namely housing, income, healthcare, and secondarily with sea level rise and improved access to the shoreline. Residents also identified a need for more education that is linguistically accessible. In East Palo Alto, we have large Latino populations, I want to say primarily of Mexican descent. We have large Tongan, Samoan populations compared to the county, and Black African American populations. So with a big part of our community being foreign-born or recent migrants, that language barrier is a big deal. Aside from that, our residents identified the need to strongly connect the daily quality of life issues to the things that they experience. And that is, doing that in a culturally competent way. In other words, in a way that recognizes the abundant assets that exist abundant assets and existing resilience in our communities and in our people. So both our community of East Palo Alto and our community members both have a lot of assets and ways that they're resilient already, right? I want to expand a little more on what it means to connect our community's issues of today to climate change. But before I do that, I feel compelled to explain why. Why is it so important that we figure out how to do that? First, we need to know that climate change is already here. Yes, it will worsen in the future, but many elements of it are already here. Second, we know transit-dependent populations such as the elderly, young children, disabled, outdoor and informal workers, low-income communities, rural communities, indigenous people, undocumented immigrants, incarcerated people, and formerly incarcerated people are disproportionately impacted by inequalities in health access, housing, economic opportunities, and the list goes on and on. Climate change has proven to worsen those existing inequities. We can't even begin to talk about disaster preparedness, adaptations, and mitigations that will truly lift up everyone in San Mateo County without understanding that the present day implications and nuances in our vastly diverse county. And they vary. They vary by geography, they vary by population. The implications and nuances vary by intensity as well. What you see up on the screen is a color-coded map of conditions in the southeast portion of the county. So East Palo Alto is completely, yes, you see East Palo Alto in that bottom right-hand corner. In regards to this map, let's talk about the housing burden piece. That's the red highlight, or the red color that you see in that bottom right-hand corner. When families in EPA are experiencing hotter summers and colder winters, that means cranking up the heat, or in some cases, if you're like my mom, you turn on the oven and leave the oven door open because that'll warm up the house, or turn up the stove. And what that means is higher utility bills, right? It means that when it gets really cold, you're cranking up those fans, because a lot of the housing in East Palo Alto doesn't have AC or doesn't have central heating. In terms of flooding and sea level rise, heavy storms, it's a challenge to talk about 50 or even 30 or 20 year horizons when families are living in precarious housing situations that makes them doubt whether they'll be around in the community that long. Like I mentioned, the current and future climate change implications and nuances vary by geography, by population, and by intensity. We need to honor that and meet our communities where they are. We need to talk about the things that are relevant to them, and do so in a way that adds value while increasing our resilience to climate change. And let's be clear that our communities are already extremely resilient in many ways. We've endured decades of injustice. Many of us are descendants of people who are survivors of colonization. By doing climate change work that honors that history, that recognizes our assets and strengths, and administers adaptations and mitigations informed by the people who bear the brunt, we will all be better for it, and a healthier county physically, mentally, and economically. That's all I have today.